Kevin and Brian touched on mining and energy. We're going to dig into that deeper in the next session. So earlier today, when I spoke on the executive order panel, there was a myth that I said, let's just put this to bed. When we talk about when people say, oh, the space is unregulated. That's a myth. This space is heavily regulated. There's many, many regulators that all have jurisdiction of this space. Many of them are here speaking and participating in today's events. So that's the first myth we're going to put to bed. The second myth is that cryptocurrencies are bad for the environment. Bitcoin is the most sustainable industry in the world, and it is driving investments and innovations in the renewable sector, and largely can be a huge tool to help us transition to a more sustainable energy, to more sustainable energy uptake. So our next session, I'm going to introduce Dennis Porter. Dennis Porter now is a member of the Compass mining team. He's also a Bitcoin advocate and a political strategist, and he'll be moderating this conversation with Fred Thiel. He's the CEO of Marathon Digital Holdings. They are a public Bitcoin mining company. We have David Perrill here. He's the CEO and co-founder of Compute North. And then Bobby Kandaswamy from National Grid Partners. Please welcome our next speakers.
All right. Very excited to be here to have this conversation with the three of you. Perry Ann did an incredible job introducing the panel and your names. So we'll just skip right past the bios and get to the very interesting part, even though the three of you do have an incredible bio and some incredible experience in your life. We really want to get really into this conversation around Bitcoin mining, the energy usage, dispel some of the myths, and talk about some of the benefits of this industry and some of the ways that it'll impact our country and our economy outside of just jobs and investment. And I'm really interested to hear what the three of you have to say. Let's go ahead and go right down the line here and start with Fred. What are some of the biggest things when you're looking at Bitcoin mining and being involved on the DC political side of things that you feel like is the most important to cover and dispel some of the myths out there and misconceptions around Bitcoin?
I think the biggest issue is really a lack of proper understanding about energy markets, how energy works, the fact that renewable energy is the first energy that gets shut off when the power grid doesn't need extra energy, and the fact that Bitcoin mining acts essentially as a huge buffer or capacitor for the energy grid by being this industry where you can shut down a manufacturing process in 10 minutes and turn it back on in about 20 minutes. Tell me one other industry that uses a lot of power that you can shut down a whole manufacturing process and start it back up with no impact. It doesn't exist. So Bitcoin mining provides this great buffer to the grid in that we can consume energy that's otherwise not being used, and when the grid needs it, we can shut down and give the consumers a buffer, which is much better than having consumers go through demand response mechanisms where when you want to run your air conditioning, guess what, you can't because there isn't enough power because the demand response is shutting it off, or they're shutting off your dryer, or they're shutting off your cooktop. It's better to take an industry like Bitcoin miners where we can shut down gladly for an hour, 2 hours when it's needed by the grid, and then provide also a huge incentive to the renewable energy industry where otherwise they don't have incentives to build out more capacity. We generate more power in this country, more energy than we need and consume. How do you incentivize an industry to build more solar and more wind energy, more hydro, when there aren't customers for it? And that's what Bitcoin miners can do. We can be a huge customer for those industries and provide them with the load consumption that they need to be profitable and operate profitably so that when the grid does need that peak generation capacity, it's available at the flip of a switch.
I'm going to jump right to Dave here because Compute North is very involved in Bitcoin mining in other ways. And something that Fred just touched on is this idea of like a flexible load. Talk about other ways that Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining can have a positive impact because of this flexible load.
Yeah, when you take a look at what's going on with the energy transition in general, I think there's a big misconception that it's going to instantly go green. I got 3 little kids. I think the whole world, and myself included, want to leave the world a better place. And we certainly want to get to more renewables. We want to get to more carbon-free. But we also, at the end of the day, want our lights to work. And I think there's a misunderstanding around the Bitcoin community that usage and generation are always tied together. And I think understanding that energy isn't a zero-sum game is probably the #1 area that we see the benefit to the energy construct. It's no question that our partners at National Grid, Constellation, one of the largest utilities in the world, Nebraska Public Power, have all partnered with companies like us at Compute North to get into this industry because of this flexibility that we provide. We see a world where we think computing can be done much more at lower cost and much more sustainable. And we think that cryptocurrency mining and Bitcoin is really leading the way of what we call tier 0 computing and a new revolution to do computing, and again, in a much better fashion.
But real quickly before we go to Bobby, talk a little bit more about that, though. What are some of the industries or areas or types of computing that will benefit directly from this type of shift?
Yeah, great question. So anything that is computationally intensive but non-mission critical. And what we're seeing that is a world where everyone talks about artificial intelligence. Everybody's talking about how to get machines to be smarter, to do things that humans are doing today. And what they miss a lot of times is how do you do that? It's through complex algorithms and complex compute called machine learning. Taking a lot of data, taking a lot of computational power, and putting out these types of problems. Tesla is probably the best known example out there, right? Everyone that's got a self-driving car, like, how does this get smarter and smarter over time? The way that happens is you take all the video, you take all the LiDAR data, you take it, hey, this is a cat. You shouldn't run into a curb and those kind of things. And over time, these algorithms get much improved and much better. But that applies not just to self-driving cars, it applies to medicine, it applies to all different types of fields. These kind of workloads are pretty unique in that they use up a lot of compute resources, but they don't need to be done in real time. Not like e-commerce or not like your Netflix or nothing that is on demand at that single point in time. And by being able to shift these, by being able to do these at the times when it makes most sense for either the grid and for the energy construct, it can get much more flexible, it can get much more in congruence with grid operators and energy production, and it can be done in a very low cost and a very sustainable manner. And so we see all types of workloads, machine learning, genome sequencing, graphic rendering, Bitcoin mining, really leading the way, going to these types of environments that are done much more sustainably and much more low cost.
Talking about grids, going to National Grid partners on Bobby for this question, how does Bitcoin mining help to change the way we see the grid? How is it going to lead us towards a world where we are managing the grid in a better position?
So, both Fred and Dave touched on the flexibility that the mining loads offer, right? So, a couple of things that I'll talk about, hopefully addressing your question around issues in the grid that can be helped out by these distributed computing workloads is one is transmission losses, right? So what Compute North does is co-locates data centers right at the source. So, as we know, data transfers over large distances much more efficiently than power because of line losses, and losses can vary anywhere from 4% to 40% depending on where in the world you are. What better way to take these resources, co-locate them right at the source, and be able to overcome that, right? So that's one piece. The demand response capability that both of them touched on as well, being the aggregate consumption, the aggregate loads that are consolidated in these data centers is enormous, right? I mean, Dave can talk about the size of the data centers that he's putting in, anywhere from 100 megawatts to 300 megawatts plus, on up, at a fraction of the cost of traditional data centers. And that offers both sort of bidirectional capability, right? When there's excess power generated that's not needed, they can absorb and take that load off. Or they're in a demand response situation where there's instead of firing up peaker plants, which are typically fossil fuel based, you could turn down these non-critical workloads and prevent using fossil fuels, right?
Talk about that really quickly, this idea of almost like a virtual power plant and how Bitcoin mining can be spun up or spun down in order to supply power back to the grid.
So just like I said, the loads that offer the flexibility by nature, right? And it's not just Bitcoin, although this is a blockchain summit focused on, to a large extent, on digital currency. These non-critical workloads from genome sequencing to imaging, et cetera, can be tuned back, right? So these are not, the type of workloads that are computer-intensive and power-hungry that would fail, right? Like a manufacturing process or a traffic light, for example, where if you don't get instant reaction, then there's catastrophic events that can happen. So by pulling these loads back, Dave, you can talk about what you're doing, in this capacity in Nebraska, for example, right? The size of these loads and the impact with one, the client being able to power back, significant amount of the load when the peak is anticipated or actually happens is enormous. In a lot of cases, utilities use these as an insurance policy. So in the event of a demand response event, how can you respond and how much capacity can you aggregate?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think one of the best case studies of this is what happened in Storm Uri. Yeah. So this was 2 years ago in Texas, unprecedented cold front came through, weather front came through, and Texas, if they're not used to one thing, it's ice and snow, especially for a 5-6 day period, and it caused mass chaos on the grid. Our types of computing scenarios in that situation, we simply shut down. The priority should be to health, human services, hospitals, heaters, humanity, just in a general sense. And so that's really what we talk about. If you kind of take a step back, through the energy transition, the grid is really built for those peak components, and that's where the ultimate infrastructure goes to. It's similar to a highway system, right? It gets congested at certain periods of time. The rest of the time, it's just free flowing. Pardon me. Same thing in the energy construct. And by us being able to be available to turn off and shut down at the times when they really need it, it creates an immense opportunity and benefit to the grid operators, the power producers, and anyone that's in the energy construct.
Going back to you, Fred, we want to move forward to this next part of the conversation. You touched on it briefly earlier, but I think we really need to narrow down and discuss how Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining specifically, or digital asset mining broadly, has a positive impact on renewables. How is it going to incentivize the build-out of renewable assets in the next 10, 20 years?
Sure. So I touched on it earlier that if you think about how power is generated and used, nuclear and coal sit at the bottom of the power stack because it runs 24/7, 365. You can't turn on and off a nuclear power plant. You can't turn up and down a coal plant very easily. Then on top of that, so that's base generation. On top of that then comes natural gas, which you can vary somewhat. There are peaker and shaver plants, but it's still hours or sometimes days to get those up and down. Last of all is solar and wind. So the US, we use peak energy between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. That's when people come home, they cook food, they do their laundry, et cetera. Most solar energy, obviously, because of when the sun shines, is morning through afternoon. So it doesn't really help in that period of time. And wind, depending on where you are, could be afternoon, it could be evening, it could be nighttime, like it is in West Texas. Again, low demand for power. So if you have to run nuclear, you have to run coal when you have it, and then comes natural gas. Those last two, the renewable ones, are the ones that get shut off for 60 to 70% of the day, which is why in Texas you have negative energy pricing, where you have renewable energy that basically they pay the grid to take it because they're generating it, and the grid otherwise doesn't have a demand for it. And so one of the key incentives that Bitcoin mining and this type of compute load provide to energy generators is you go behind the meter at the point of energy generation, which is where we're co-locating in Texas, which is behind the meter at a big wind farm. And we can provide load when there otherwise isn't a consumer for that energy. So what happens? Well, we're paying them for lots of kilowatt hours of production, which they can then shut off when they need to feed the grid. The grid then pays them while we're not operating, And then as soon as the grid doesn't need it, we operate again. So all of a sudden, they can now get essentially full coverage and full sales of their power generating capacity. I'll give you an example. We were approached not long ago by a company that operates essentially cruise ship ports in Alaska. And the cruise line industry wanted to have access to renewable energy for the 8 hours a day during a 4-month period when they're in those ports. And this cruise port operator said, okay, if we have to build a hydroelectric facility, because they needed to be renewable energy, how are we going to justify it when we can only sell electricity for 8 hours a day for 4 months? Well, somebody there sort of put on their thinking cap and said, how about if we mine Bitcoin for the rest of the time? Because that will cover all our costs and allow us to amortize and spread the cost, therefore lowering the cost to the cruise ship line and making it sense to do this project. So Bitcoin mining is a customer that doesn't need to be connected to the grid necessarily. It doesn't need access to like consumers, and it can be interrupted. So it's this perfect absorption mechanism for excess energy that provides a financial incentive for us to build out much more renewable energy. And the only way we're going to build more renewable energy is if the energy providers have an incentive to do it. And outside of tax dollars, actual customers are the best incentive you can give a renewable energy company.
Yeah, we need that incentive there, and some people, I think the term is like buyer of last resort or buyer of first resort. Really quickly, I know none of you probably think that Bitcoin is going to zero anytime soon, but let's talk a little bit about it, going to Dave here. Should policymakers be concerned at all about all the infrastructure that's being built right now currently around Bitcoin mining? If Bitcoin were to disappear tomorrow, would this just be a net loss for our industry?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question we always get commonly. Like, what happens in a scenario when this goes to zero? And maybe I'll touch on that question first. I have 25 years of data centers, managed services, so I cut my teeth during the 90s and during the internet, right? When the internet really came to be. And what made the internet so powerful was standards, right? There was this TCP/IP protocol that all these computers could all suddenly talk to. Everybody knew what it was. And where the real value add started is people started to build applications, right? They built the web, then they built, real audio player, and I'll date myself a little bit, and you could listen to these things over audio back in the day. Suddenly we got streaming video, we got all these new types of things, and now, as we all know, it's just, it's gone and it's been endless. I see Bitcoin in a similar trajectory. I see it as a standard. I see it being here for 13 years. I see what's called layer 2, a lot of innovation starting to happen around that ecosystem, and even, I think Lightning was mentioned earlier on by one of the panelists, just some of the just really neat and innovative technology that's going around that. And so it's following that same trajectory, which is why we're very comfortable that this is a technology that's going to stay here. Now, there's other great blockchains. I mean, there's some really neat stuff that's going on. There's some great innovation. I know Charles Hokinson's here with Cardano, for example, and I mean, they're pressing the border on some things, and it's not a winner-take-all. But standards in computing and technology are really essential and really important, and they stick. Look at your keyboard. It's still there because it was the hardest and slowest thing, so typewriters wouldn't jam back in the day, and it actually slows you down, and it's what we use today. And I could use, the example goes on. And so we're going to see that trajectory. Now, that being said, we see Bitcoin mining, crypto mining, again, being at the size and scale and the interruptible nature that it's opening up the mechanism for these other types of workloads to start to come to fruition. One of the customers that we're onboarding right now does CT scans at massive scale. And what's incredible about what I learned about CT scans is that 30% of CT scans are misdiagnosed. Now think about that for a second. So 30% of those scans that are going through they're read wrong. And computing and machine learning and image analysis and the types of things that we can do can help make that and drive that closer to near zero and truly save lives. But today they can't do it because it's too costly to do in these public clouds. And they don't have the computing capacity to make it work. And so those are the types of scenarios that I think we're, again, very early innings, we're going to continue to build upon, and why we're very excited about the future of what we're, again, calling tier zero computing.
Another aspect of that is also just the transition to Web 3. Right? In Web 3, you're bifurcating data from application. Data resides on the blockchain. It's under the ownership of either the consumer or the company whose data it is. By the way, you can't ransomware the blockchain. Right? So that would get rid of a huge amount of cybercrime right there. And then the applications only need to run, to Dave's point, when you actually need to do it. Think about how an Amazon data center works today. It's running 24/7, 365 because the data has to be alive. Well, if the data's on the blockchain, which means it's replicated in millions of places, you don't need to do that. And so the infrastructure from Bitcoin mining is going to be used over and over again for these other use cases, the ones Dave mentioned, and lots of use cases we haven't even covered yet.
I want to circle back around here to Bobby and talk about wasted and stranded energies. I think it's such an important part of the conversation. Today, we waste upwards of 30 to 40% of the energy that we create, and it either just gets plugged into the ground or the grid doesn't actually pick it up. What are some of the ways that Bitcoin mining is helping to monetize or bring value to all of the wasted energy that we create today in our economy?
Sure. So one of the main reasons curtailment happens, right, is because there's something in the grid that cannot accept. So curtailment happens when there's excess generator capacity over what demand is. So the grid's not able to absorb that. So sometimes it's a limitation in line capacity. So the line can only carry so much load. And in these cases, co-located data center like Dave's acts as an off-take partner. So for the renewable energy generator, it provides better utilization rather than letting the assets sit. And for the grid operators, it offers a better way to balance costs, being able to improve utilization as well. So overall, I think it's a win-win on both fronts. And when the renewable energy generators have to bid out prices and have some form of stability or over time as to how much money they can generate out of those assets, this can serve as a huge benefit as well.
Yeah, we see how Bitcoin is going to monetize wasted and stranded energy, which is oftentimes created by renewables. Another important conversation, though, that we should touch on while we have the time to get into it is talking about the economic benefit of Bitcoin mining to others, not just to the companies themselves, but to the jobs on the ground, to the investment that's coming into local communities. I know when I went to visit the Riot facility in Texas, there were people there that were just smiling with these jobs that they have. But talk about, Fred, I'll go to you first, and we'll kind of go down the line and see where you guys have to add to this conversation around the benefits of Bitcoin mining and how it's bringing economic value to local constituencies. But start with you, Fred.
Sure. So in certain communities, if you think about the Bitcoin mining industry, we're constantly looking for stranded energy that can't be sold somewhere else because we're the buyer of last resort. So typically, those are in locations where there was a large industrial base, and that industrial base left the country, whether it was because of offshoring or whatever the reason was. So now you have a power plant that can generate electricity. You used to have manufacturing facilities, and you had a lot of jobs in an area, and those jobs disappeared. The power plant oftentimes had to shut down or idle. And so when a Bitcoin miner comes into that area, for one thing, the power plant goes back online, and you now need jobs to build the data center, manage, operate the data center, and if, depending on the fuel source of the power plant, there can also be jobs related to the fueling of that power plant. And Dave operates tons of data centers, and he can most probably speak much better about the actual number of jobs, but I've just seen the benefits that we provided in Montana to a facility where we operated. We provided a lot of income to the area, some of which were to Native Americans, because that facility is located on the Crow Indian Reservation, and it provided jobs to the people, it provided jobs to the fuel source and all that. So it has a significant impact on these communities, which otherwise don't have jobs for the people.
It also has a positive impact on the tax basis of those areas that you guys are going to as well. But Dave, I'd love you to expand on this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I guess our approach at Compute North is we've just been immensely candid, transparent, and upfront, particularly with local government officials, economic development, and we've been welcomed with open arms. We're headquartered in Minneapolis. We have operations in Texas, South Dakota, and Nebraska today. We have other locations that we're currently under development and scouting right now. And we bring local jobs. We hire locally within the communities, both on the construction, the development side, and then on an ongoing basis. We pay significant tax revenues, particularly on the actual energy costs that we produce. There's always some sort of component within that that goes along with it. And we bring an innovation angle and something to the community that they otherwise wouldn't have. Training mechanisms, being able to do just learning scenarios. They can do field trips, whether it be local schools and colleges. And I guess, each one of these locations is immensely local, and it is to that community. I think that's really, really important. I think, Chad and the team at Riot do a really good job of that with Windstone and Rockdale, which was a big industrial complex that went the other direction, and they've really done a nice job of breathing life into that. And so we have a similar scenario and a similar trajectory and a similar approach. And again, thus far I've been welcomed with open arms. I think like anything, it's been a nascent industry. There certainly was some bad actors in the early days. I think the good news is, these types of things have a tendency to wash those out, and the good players are still the ones left standing. And obviously we're proud of the partners that we have here assembled on stage.
Let's go. I mean, we've covered the economic impact, the positive economic impact quite a bit here. I would like to chat briefly, coming back to you, Fred, just to discuss how Bitcoin mining has become more efficient over time. And you at Marathon probably know best how incredible the advancements have been in the Bitcoin mining space, the digital asset space broadly.
Yeah, so if you think about the generation of mining equipment that was deployed 5-6 years ago, it was used 3 to 4 times the amount of energy that current generation miners use to produce the same output. So huge impact on energy efficiency. Even the S19, which is kind of the state-of-the-art miner that most miners are deploying today, the next generation of that machine, which starts shipping here just about now, is 33% more efficient than that even. And so we're seeing the efficiency, the energy efficiency, or the energy consumption go down to produce the same output as it's moving along. We're also moving to things like immersion technologies, which will allow us to run Bitcoin miners more efficiently, with the same amount of energy load and quietly. There won't be any fans going anymore.
Talk about what that is, what that looks like, the immersion cooling.
Immersion is essentially you take electronics and you put them in a bath of a liquid that doesn't conduct electricity. And that, think of it as like a radiator, cools an engine, right? You're pumping water through the engine. This is essentially you're pumping a dielectric fluid through around the components of a the computer that's running really hot, and it takes the energy away. And now you can reuse that energy. You can use it for drying wood like they do in Scandinavia. You can use it to heat buildings. You can use it to heat greenhouses. You can repurpose that energy. Another thing that's happening in this industry is with the move potentially to microgrids, where you move away from centralized power generation to edge power generation. You can economically today use solar together with batteries and a small amount of Bitcoin mining in immersion to essentially fund the development of these microgrids at the community level. Now you're not impacting the grid at all because you don't have to go on the grid. People are going to essentially have their own power generation to use, and the Bitcoin mining operation funds build out of that infrastructure and helps subsidize the cost of the electricity. So it's a very symbiotic relationship. So I think there are lots of things that are going to happen in this industry that Bitcoin mining essentially is funding the initiatives to do, and it's also driving a lot of these development initiatives, and we're proud to be backing a lot of those things.
Just real quickly, just touching on this subject a little bit more of the machines that have been coming out and the development of machines. Should people be concerned at all about the long-term trajectory of these machines kind of outpacing each other and any sort of e-waste that could be accumulated because of this?
So, I can't see a show of hands here because of the lights, but most people think that there are hundreds of millions of Bitcoin mining rigs installed around the world. The total number is about 3.5 million. These machines, when they die, they don't really die. We're still running machines in Bitcoin mining operations around the world, which are 5, 6, 7 years old, profitably. And when those machines can't be run profitably, you deprecate them, meaning you deploy them in a site where you have negative energy pricing. So you only turn them on when energy is free or so cheap that it makes sense to run them, because you've already paid for the machines. So it's not an issue to only run them a few hours a day, possibly. And so think about iPhones. You're holding an iPhone in your hand, right? How many billion smartphones get sold a year? And they typically last 2 years, and then they get thrown away. The amount of e-waste in a phone, the toxic chemicals, all of that, in the type of consumer electronics that people buy, gaming consoles, et cetera, huge. A Bitcoin miner is some bent aluminum that can be reused and repurposed, and hash boards, which can be recycled to a certain extent. So, the whole e-waste argument around Bitcoin mining is ridiculous. It's kind of like the energy thing. You know, Bitcoin mining on a global scale uses 0.16% of the global energy mix. It uses less energy on a global basis than running the holiday lights in North America at Christmas. It uses less energy than gaming consoles use. So all of you who have kids who are gamers out there, you're using more energy than our industry is using. You got to put it in context. Yes, it's more than the country of Norway, but North America's energy consumption is off the charts when you think about it in comparison to Bitcoin mining.
Would you call it one of the most efficient uses of energy that you could possibly find as far as the industries that you've just touched on?
It's the single most efficient way to convert energy into money.
Real quickly, because we have very little bit time left, but I wanted to go back to Bobby for one last little point here around the idea of these microgrids or creating energy assets. We're talking about being off-grid, so is this something that could benefit small communities around the globe, not just necessarily in the United States, but you have areas of the world where they have no way to get access to energy, so having the Bitcoin miners come in or digital asset miners come in and incentivize the build-out of energy in places like Africa or other developing countries. Could you comment on that briefly?
So no, I agree. I think anything to offset the initial cost, right, to set up and the way to recoup that through another source of revenue is absolutely justifiable, right? And microgrids have been talked about for a while, but for various reasons have been taken off, cost being one, limited to military applications and such, right? This provides an opportunity to take it more broader into areas that, like you said, have no access to power today, when parts of India are the same as well, right? So.
Well, we ended right at the exact 0, so someone's got to give us a star for that. Thank you, everybody. Please give a round of applause. Bobby, Dave, Fred, thank you so much.